One of the nothing to do with Leo the Last, but in a sense a really strange echo across the water. In 1970, Hal Ashby made his debut with The Landlord, which was a film about almost exactly the same themes, written by Bill Gunn, the great black American scriptwriter and filmmaker. And it came out in the same year with the idea of a rich, endowed and privileged white landowner taking ownership of a property that he didn't know about previously, and in a very different way, giving it back to the people. I mean, it's really extraordinary parallel. Obviously, the themes in the culture were happening at the same time, and very much, between America and the UK. This has a lot of kind of American cultural strategies in it, particularly around the music. But just interesting to have that in mind as a kind of parallel to what was going on here. But Ed, look, it's great to have you with us, and great to have this extended appreciation of the film and kind of cultural reading of the landscape, both physical and political, historical, cultural, of the time. How did you come to the film, and why did you want to take it on in the way you did?
Well, I've heard about the film in the aftermath of the Grenfell fire, which was an unexpected connection. I'd written a book about the A40 quite a long time ago now, and I was sent back, because Grenfell was right next to the Westway, I was sent back to write about Grenfell after it happened. And it was very hard to get anywhere to talk to anyone in that vicinity, because people were so angry and upset. And there was huge suspicion of the MSM, as they were called at the time, the mainstream media. It was 2017. It was a year after Brexit, a year after Trump. There was a lot of hostility to journalists of any kind. But I was introduced to a man who lived in one of the walkways, as they call them, the horizontal towers at the foot of Grenfell, who was willing to talk to me off the record. And he told me that John Boorman had made a film in the spot. We went into his flat, and we were sitting on his balcony looking up at the tower at the end of the garden. And he told me that John Boorman had made a film more or less in the spot where we were sitting. And actually, he lived in Testerton Walk, and that Leo's house is in Testerton Street. So, and I'd never heard of this film. I thought I knew Boorman's work reasonably well. This one comes after, Leo the Last came after Point Blank and before Deliverance. So it's in between those two films, which are quite well known. But I'd never heard of Leo the Last. So I tracked it down. And as you said earlier, it's not easy to find. The only copy I could find was the Spanish one, Leo El Ultimo. And I watched that on... Actually, it was really lovely to see it on the screen, because I've only ever seen it on my laptop. And actually, and because the soundtrack is so important, dubbing it into Spanish was a nightmare. And it doesn't really work. So I've never seen it in the cinema. But I watched the film. I watched it in the Spanish version, and obviously I was struck by the fact that it ends with a fire, and that was something that I wanted to explore.
No, thank you very much. I mean, the kind of the disturbing prescience of that is unnerving, to say the least. With the streets we see, as you mentioned, they no longer exist, of course. We'll come on to perhaps about how that was constructed with Peter's cinematography in a minute. But what was your sense? I mean, obviously not that I wouldn't say there was a collective memory of the film, of course, because it doesn't quite work like that. But was there, beyond the gentleman you spoke to, was there any sense that there was a wider awareness of the film in the community around you at that point?
There was, yeah. I mean, when I asked around, people did know about it. There was an artist in residence on the Lancaster West estate who'd done a lot of work on it. I met a woman who'd lived in the area for 40 odd years, and she remembered the film, not with any great fondness, because she was a housing campaigner, and she was angry about the fact that the houses that you see in the film are all empty because they've been condemned, and they're about to be pulled down to make way for the estate. And it was at the time that the Westway was being built through that stretch of West London. So she remembered the film. She wasn't greatly taken with it at the time, though she said she saw it later and began to appreciate it. But she remembered the explosion at night when the house was blown up. And I mean, I thought there was, great romance in the idea of this Mastroianni, this amazing film star who came to London and worked in this set which they'd built in these abandoned houses in West London.
No, I mean, it was his first English language film, and I mean, watching it again now, particularly the first time I've seen it on the bigger screen, and the sound design, of course, is absolutely crucial, as you say. The coloration of the filmography, the shooting is really important. We'll come on to that now. You mentioned the condemned streets, of course, but Peter specifically blackened, didn't he, the whole street? In a way, a strange echo of what Antonioni did with the grass in Marion Wilson Park in Blow Up, where he painted it green because it wasn't green enough for Antonioni. So there's this idea of kind of colouring the real world environment more than more than the real in a way. But that condemning of the streets, of course, is in a way highlighted by that fact, but sets off a really striking. What you could say is a sort of black and white mise en scène, which then is massively complicated by the politics that unfold.
Yeah. Well, Boorman, he apparently, or in his memoir, he says he felt that the film was slightly overstuffed, I suppose, which is, as we've just seen, there's a lot going on in it. It's quite uneven tonally, stylistically. He made a decision to make it black and white, to simplify the colour palette, if nothing else. So yes, he painted all the houses were painted black. There's a bottle, apparently, a yellow bottle in the scene in the pub, which Boorman said made him feel sick every time he saw it, because it's the one kind of splash of colour. I was looking for it tonight and I missed it. So it's obviously, so that kind of director's aesthetic, he was, the yellow offended him, but I didn't see it.
Yeah, I mean, there's apparently a Porsche in Ben Hur, isn't there, just outside the Colosseum? But the shot was so expensive they couldn't remove it. I mean, now digitally they probably have, but if you were watching it on TV, like in the 70s and so on, it would just parked outside. I mean, good to have it close by, I suppose. No. I mean, it's. I mean, what? Of course, when you're world making in that way, with with a film that, as you say, is tonally very wayward, shall we say? The more I see it, the more I realise that it just can't be held by any of the conventional understandings of what British film is and does. It's much closer to anarchism than a conventional left kind of political position.
Yeah, I mean, I think of it as a companion piece to If, which is more or less the same time, and they're the two kind of British films about revolution. And actually, when you watch them, you see why we've never had a revolution, because we can't seem to conceive of it in anything other than slightly surreal terms. I mean, If is interesting because it all takes place in a public school boarding house, and you might argue that gets right to the heart of the matter, that the public school system is the core of the English class system, but on the other hand it feels slightly whimsical and unengaged with broader reality. And this is similar. It's an incredibly whimsical, surreal kind of revolution. I mean, it's rather wonderful as well, the fact that they burn the house down using fireworks, and there's no violence apart from Leo's stigmata. No,
absolutely. I mean, it's also, thinking of Lindsay Anderson and If, it's also, very much a kind of a fellow traveller with Oh Lucky Man, which is in George's season later on, which genuinely has, again, a very wide-ranging tonal palette and a kind of strong musical element as well, which is evident here. So once you had this kind of seed of this relationship between film and local history, you started digging much more into the history of the streets and the area. Notting Dale, as you subtitle this publication. And you realised, of course, that there were all sorts of kind of covert energies and histories in that area, as you would expect, of course, across the whole of London. But several of them tie in directly, I think, with some of the elements we've seen in the film to do with the laundry, for example, and other elements. Could you just expand on that a little?
Yeah, well, it was known as it was always known as a very poor area. It was originally colonised by pig farmers, I believe, from Tyburnia. It was a group of people who'd moved west from as London expanded. And in the 19th century, on those maps of poverty, it was always marked black. It was always the poorest area. Colin McInnes, Absolute Beginners, talks about the railway streets of West London and says there's nothing to do with them except pull them down, which was, of course, what happened. Happened very soon after this film was shot. And then, of course, it was also the Rackman's terrain. So the notorious, famous slum landlord Rackman operated in that area. And Laszlo, the wonderful, sardonic, difficult to read servant of Leo, I feel, has something of Laszlo in him. Sorry, has something of Rackman in him. Yeah.
I mean, you're known as, among many other things, as a really keen and acute writer of place, and this tracking, which you detail extensively in the publication, of how the topography of the streets has changed. You suggest, of course, not just a physical or cartographic shift, but of course a huge financial shift, a wealth shift in the way that the area has gone. It's impossible to imagine, even a fraction of the reality we've seen on screen, however surreal it might be, in the contemporary Notting Hill area.
Yeah, yeah.
And no, please carry on.
Yeah, I was going to say Goldman Sachs land is what a lot of it's known now. Because it's home to bankers and oligarchs, but those extremes are, they're still there. I met, when I was writing about Grenfell, I met a woman who had set up a fundraising group, who lived. She was black, which I mentioned because it's relevant to the story, and she lived in a flat overlooking an oligarch's house, two big houses knocked into one. And one afternoon, her daughter saw a black man in the garden of this oligarch's house, and she thought, she was only 5 or 6, she thought he was a spy in the world of billionaires. And then she realised he was a waiter serving drinks. And that's the world of Leo. I mean, it feels exactly the same. You have the story about the rich man in his house, surrounded by these spots of poverty.
Absolutely. Well, in that way, then, of course, my opening comments to you in that question were completely wrong. The reality is still there in place, of course.
Well, it's there in places, yeah. But clearly the area has changed in other ways, yeah.
I mean, there are several, websites, London location websites, that you can go to where, the streets of Leo the Last are shown, and a version of the filmic sort of mapping is possible. You go into a much greater and deeper level of inquiry around that. But in the sense of how, places, and this is something that, say, Peter Ackroyd, has written extensively on, how certain places channel in London. This is maybe too psychogeographical for some people, but channel a certain kind of energy, a certain form of, of kind of social or cultural mapping that resurfaces at different times.
Yeah, that's interesting. And in connection with Grenfell, it felt difficult to propose that idea because of the sensitivities. But I thought that the theme that resurfaced, which was really interesting and really profound, and which is what makes the film, I think, is the film's greatest strength, is this idea of looking or seeing. Because it's a film entirely. I mean, cinema is voyeuristic. It's a film about voyeurism. It begins with Leo overlooking his neighbours in more than one sense. He's above them. He's looking down on them. He doesn't notice them, but gradually they attract his attention, and he engages with them. With the consequences that we see, we end up with this kind of chaotic overturning of the social order, beginning purely with the act of looking and noticing and seeing. And that was the great complaint around Grenfell. All the people who lived in Grenfell and lived in that area, that they were ignored and they were overlooked and they weren't seen. And in fact, the cladding, the fatal cladding that was put on the tower, was done to hide the tower. It was done to make it look better to people who lived around it, so they wouldn't see it. It wouldn't stand out. So in that sense, I felt there was a very strong pattern that repeated. Yeah.
No, thank you for that. I mean, obviously for bringing attention to what cinema does inherently, but how it absolutely is, politically activated here. I mean, the film, was turned down by a number of studios. United Artists took it in the end, and Boorman had final cut, so they were unhappy with the cut, and you can see why, perhaps. Thinking they would have, a kind of romantic drama, perhaps in the heart of a slowly gentrifying area. I mean, I think, like we said just now, it can't be held by the normal conventions of how we understand British cinema. It takes on all the various tropes of cultural practice of the 60s and kind of mashes them all up together, in a kind of huge sort of farewell to that decade. But obviously doesn't shy away from what we think of in a kind of slightly cliched way of the 70s, again, as a place of greater discord, but also where the political realities of the 60s come home to roost. What I really like about it, I think, is that it doesn't propose an answer as such, but it has a reaction to what it doesn't like and sets that in motion. And then, the following day, of course, people have to carry on and find a new way to be in relation with each other, which is always the accusation leveled by the right at the left that they don't have a solution. But actually you can ask questions and you can make the first step, I think, which is a very powerful sort of position to take, actually. It'd be great to hear from you. Have people seen thank you. Have people seen the film before? Has anyone seen the film before? Gentleman at the back, yeah. I'd like to come to you then and now. It'd be great in a minute if we could. I'll hold that thought at the moment. Yeah, let's start. Could we start here, please? There's a question here. There's a hand at the back. A few others, yeah. Let's get them all in. Yeah, thank you.
Cheers. Before my question, I just want to say it was interesting hearing you guys pair the film with The Landlord and If. The other film I thought of, the other British film I thought of is Peter Medak's The Ruling Class, which is another kind of whimsical depiction of the impossibility of revolution and dreams of revolution bumping up against the realities of the British class system. My question was, in the real street, do you happen to know, was there really this lordly manor house in amongst the terraces, or is this an invention of the movie? And indeed, was the script of the movie developed with this particular Notting Hill location in mind, or was it just something they found in the production?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, the story was based on a film was based on a story by George Tabori, I think which was set in Brooklyn, and it was a similar idea about a man who comes back to claim his inheritance. It was more Oedipal. He's so shocked by what he sees that he takes his eyes out in the end. Boorman liked the idea, but he'd just made Point Blank. I always have to remember not to call it Point Break. He wanted to come back to London. He thought that it would have more, he'd be able to explore the social nuances better in London. And yet he also wanted to blur that slightly, which the casting of Mastroianni managed. It gave it a slightly different feel. The street, which is called Testerton Street or Testerton Road, which is where the walkway is now, was a cul-de-sac. So there were 3 houses across the end of it, but they built the facade. So the main set building, the houses that had been painted black on either side were there. There was a row of 3 houses at the end, and they built the facade across it, which made it look like a grand kind of embassy mansion. And that's what you see falling down at the end. So,
thank you. Yes, please. Yeah, we'll get the microphone up and just put the cameras in place. Just remember, you are being filmed, of course, in the spirit. Everyone's looking at everyone else. Thank you. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Apart from The Landlord, which, it's uncannily overlapping with, the film that I thought of, because Gareth, you mentioned Blow Up, is Zabriskie Point, which I'm very interested in, also as a film that has sort of been deleted from everything, partially because of Antonioni's decision-making, studio intervention, also ends with a big explosion. Though in Zabriskie Point they sort of plastered on a Roy Orbison song to try and sort of, I don't know. The point I want to make, or the question I want to ask rather, is in this film and in Zabriskie Point, the sort of quote-unquote real revolutionaries, or the people that are most committed to their political cause and taking action, are the sort of slightly weird aristocrats that live in the basement, or they don't, or they're also the beneficiaries of this landlording scheme. As in Zabriskie Point, the political read on the film is quite weird and confusing, and when I was watching it, I kept on coming back to Antonioni's film, and when I watched that, trying to work out, is this confusing because there's some confused direction? Is it confusing because the lead is supposed to be confused? Is it confusing because it's sort of mapping a political imaginary that I can't really grapple with? And yeah, I wonder if you could comment on what your read of that is, particularly in light of what ended up happening in this area.
I think it's a very hard film to read in conventional political terms. I mean, the political analysis does not go very far. And you know, as we said before, it's tonally so varied, and the grotesque scenes in the house, I think, are the least successful parts of the film, and they push it into an area that I don't think Boorman was entirely in control of. It doesn't feel like an entirely resolved piece of work, but in a way, that's why it's interesting. I mean, I think he was more interested in. He felt that the film failed. Hubris was the word he used, because he threw too much at it. The soundtrack, the caricatures, the kind of slapstick comedy, and I think that was what engaged him more than the politics. So he was interested in this perverse kind of portrait of a society rather than a political analysis of it. If that answers.
Thank you. Yes, please. Thank you. We should say, just before we come to this, please carry on, is that I mentioned in the introduction that on the 6th of May 2020 we were hoping to have this great screening with everyone here. Likewise here, of course, as well. John was all set to come from County Wicklow in Ireland up until the 6th of January, when it became clear that he wasn't able to make it. He's an elderly man now. He's 92 on the 18th of January, on Saturday. Brinsley Ford now lives in Poland. It was tricky for him to get across. Ramjohn Holder is just a couple of months younger than John. Peter was unable to, very sadly, the cinematographer. So they're all with us, and John was extremely happy that this screening was happening and very touched by the fact of it happening. So I just put that into the mix. They are with us, if they're not quite here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'm just curious as to why the film isn't slightly better known now, because it could be shown, as a historical, architectural sort of land piece, because this London just doesn't exist. I remember it only from the late 70s, like bedsit land, and a lot of the architecture and the beautiful old houses, and they were just turned into rooms. And I saw some of them. Unfortunately, didn't move in, but. And I remember that. But it's also with Peter Jasinski's cinematography, because I saw a lot of his still photographs at the Austrian Cultural Centre. They had films, and I actually saw him do a Q&A. Oh my God, was he 100 years old, something like that? He lived...
that's your grandfather, yeah? That's
yeah.
Wolf, that's
right.
Peter's father. Yeah.
I beg your pardon, actually. No, you got me wrong. You got me wrong there.
I mean, incredible artist as well, right?
Yes,
I mean,
absolutely. I'm sorry, that's my slightly... But yeah, if you could sort of talk about why, because it really should be seen. I mean, my God, it's better than Notting Hill, for Christ's sakes. I mean
yeah, well, the documentary aspect of it is fascinating, and you get those shots, those beautifully composed shots of the street, and you know that you're looking at a world that has gone, and they were pulled down a year or two later. And there's a fascinating archive of photographs in the Kensington Library, which was very much in demand 3 or 4 years ago, because people were going to look at pictures of that area at the time Grenfell was being built. But they'd sent a council photographer to shoot these streets just before they were demolished, after the film had been made. So they were all painted black still, or a lot of them were black, but they were beginning to fall apart even more because they'd been uninhabited for a couple of years. And it's an extraordinary record of urban dereliction. And fascinating because it was the high point of that modernist-inspired post-war reconstruction, the process of urban renewal that saw the construction of the Westway. And the Lancaster West Estate, which Grenfell is part of, was originally conceived on much more Corbusian lines. There was a plan to separate the cars and the people, and plan to provide more around the estate to make it more of a kind of livable district. But in the end it wasn't built like that, partly because, as always, they'd run out of money, and also because the modernist project, that scheme of urban renewal, was beginning to lose its intellectual energy. You'd had Jane Jacobs, and it was all, people were beginning to question the whole.
Do you feel then that it had sort of similarities with the kind of the post-war building in the East End, in the Festival of Britain, and that, again, there's some very, very grand schemes for that, and then by the 60s and the early 70s, the money had run out, or the interest had gone, and it was pretty much a slum area again.
Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, question here, and then we'll go to the gentleman. Yeah, yes, please.
I think you mentioned in the intro that this film won the Palme d'Or at Cannes.
No, John won Best Director.
Oh, he won Best Director.
Yeah.
Okay, I just wondered, in light of that, whether the film did well in Europe or here. It just seems like...
No, it didn't, no. No, it didn't do well. I mean, there's a great quote you can find online from one of the executives at United Artists, who had to do an inventory, a kind of report on the films of that particular period, and he talks about how, if it had been a few hundreds of thousands, it would have been okay. We could have sort of let it go. But the implication is, of course, it wasn't. It was quite a lot more than that. And he just reports back to the board about, certain titles that were problematic, and this is one of them. But Boorman had contractually final cut, and he'd had some major successes in the 60s. But some of you might have seen his 3-part television documentary series about Bristol from the earlier 60s, which is really a kind of sets up this film in all sorts of ways. Actually, it's very, very. It follows a young couple moving into a flat in Bristol. This is like 63, 64, something like that, and tracks them through their lives over a period of a couple of years. Really strong documentary eye. I mean, really, really keen sense of social relations and changing cities and so on. It's not available at all. I think it's probably online. You'll probably find it on YouTube, but that's again, there are certain parts of Boorman's filmography that just completely slide, while others who are maybe more containable as bodies of work, in a singular direction, like Ken Loach or such like, who I love. I mean, I love Ken Loach's work, but there aren't these outliers in the same way, but no, it didn't do very well.
But it is worth saying it did better in France than it did here. I mean, it won, as you say, it won the Director's Prize at Cannes, and then I think, won the Palme d'Or. So the French did take to these slightly playful British stabs at revolution rather better than we did.
No, I mean, that's a really important point to say. The French, I mean, Cannes is so crucial to British auteur directors' careers. Ken Loach has had more films in competition than any other film director. And they love Mike Leigh, of course, etc., etc. They love that British take on reality, and particularly Lindsay Anderson, who never had a good time here. It was never served well.
Yeah. And I think sadly Mastroianni didn't sell the film in the way he should have done. He wasn't a kind of multiplex actor. I mean, he's a wonderful actor and he absolutely holds the film together. But I think he was more easier to sell on the continent than.
Thank you. Yes, please. Yeah.
Thank you. One can see, or I feel that there's a tradition also that's being picked up from, you go back through Richard Lester's films where you have these off-screen voices coming in, commenting quite often. And then you got Oh, What a Lovely War and The Bed-Sitting Room. You go back to, which is not a Lester film, Oh, What Lovely War, sorry, yes. And How I Won the War was the Leicester film. But those British, almost goonish kind of films, there's something of that. But don't you think also that he is bringing in something of the continental tradition, Terem, for example, and he's got Mastroianni as the leading actor. So that's by way of a comment. What I wanted to ask, do you think that there's a line that can be drawn at all with another West London film performance?
Yes. There's certainly, it's one of the other great Notting Hill films. Performance, Leo the Last, perhaps Notting Hill.
And Decay, isn't it?
Yes, there are similarities. I haven't seen Performance for so long. I wouldn't want to talk about it. But
I think the fact of performance is so central to this, isn't it? Given that it started as a play script, and the sort of the self-dramatization of so many of the characters, their conscious theatricality, is again another interesting. It doesn't always work, but again, it's this idea which I think you sort of mentioned in a different way earlier, is that why can't a work, it can fail in certain areas, but it should still be considered, it should be kept on the table, and that's what frustrates me so much about how this has been treated. I mean, it's not alone in that, but given John's filmography and the reputation he carries elsewhere, they should be considered at least, and taken into the mix. That's why it's so great that we can show it here. Are there any more thoughts or questions? I don't want to pin the gentleman at the back to your then and now screening, but is it worth? Yeah, we'd be curious to know what you thought, whether it still stood up, whether it didn't stand up before.
Yes, well, I enjoyed it before, 55 years ago, but I'd just like to say, if this is, I'm sure it'll go through to Mr. Boorman, I'm just a great admirer of his work, and Zardoz, for example, just amazing. Most of his films are tremendous. I would say this was worthy but confused. I mean, that's my tiny phrase on that. But performance, I'm finishing a book on Nick Rogue and his film. So I've interviewed James Fox and Donald Cammell and David Cammell. Now, just a quick plug for John Boorman's books. He's done one recently called Conclusions. I think that's the right title, and that's a great one. But a wonderful early one that he wrote was called Money into Light, and I think it's one of the great titles because that's filmmaking, isn't it? The money ends up in what we make of the light coming from the screen. I think that's really all I've got to say, but worthy but confused, maybe much like me, but anyway. Yeah. Thank you. And thank you, John Boorman.
No, well, thank you, and thank you very much for giving us the first time release response. 55 years later, yeah, extraordinary. Yeah, Money to Light, of course, his diary of making the Emerald Forest, and always published by Faber, the great Walter Donahue at Faber, great film editor at the publisher, who's brought so many great books into being, including John's later books. If there are any more thoughts, yes, please. Yeah, here. Thank you. And Adam, I'm going to ask you whether you want to pin you down for a quick conclusion comment, only if you want to.
Yeah, you've talked a bit about films that were being made kind of concurrently, that in the same style, like If, and things like that. But what do you see as kind of later, sort of following in the same tradition later? Because the thing I kept thinking of while I was watching that was another interesting but very uneven film, Sammy and Rosie Get Laid, Hanif Kureishi and Stephen Frears, which has a lot of kind of plot elements and in common with this, and that similar idea of like just burning the whole place down kind of thing. Do you see any kind of like imprint of Leo the Last on films that followed, even though it kind of maybe isn't that well known?
Well, again, I haven't seen Sammy and Rosie since it first came out, which is probably
87, I think it was out.
Yeah. I mean, so I wouldn't really like to say.
But is it really has it left no imprint? Do you think on British this Leo the Last? Yeah, has it left no imprint?
I think Boorman's films have, but I think, as Gareth has been saying, this has pretty much disappeared. And that strand of speculative, surrealistic, political movie making didn't seem to go very far. So it seems unkind to call it a dead end because it's such a fertile avenue to have pursued. But I don't think it created a.
And I think those. I mean, again, just without full knowledge, but I mean, there are one-offs that pop up every so often. There's a film called Rocinante by Anne and Eduardo Guedes, which stars Ian Dury as a kind of jester, and John Hurt as a man travelling around abandoned cinemas in the UK. And they were a Portuguese couple. She's still alive, and they were part of Cinema Action, this 70s political filmmaking movement. But Rocinante is completely disappeared. It was an early Channel 4 film, and that was like 82, so that was like 10 or 11 years later. And every so often one pops up, but unless it's nurtured or somehow held by another structure, it disappears, particularly if the filmmakers themselves don't have such a secure base, I think. I mean, it's interesting, the gentleman at the back writing the book on Nick Rogue, which we look forward to. The only director with 2 films in the season is Nick Rogue, with Bad Timing and Don't Look Now. The season continues. I mean, it's only just begun, as the Carpenters said, of course. We've got, 6 weeks of it left. Great titles. A lot of them have sold out, George. But there are still many tickets available. For some of the less popular titles, all of which should be very, very popular indeed. Personal shout out for The Shout. If you haven't seen The Shout, deliriously extraordinary film. Alan Bates really giving it his all. An incredible list of films. Pender's Fen, of course, Jubilee, Oh Lucky Man, we've mentioned. Red Shift, fantastic, Alan Garner. Great season. Huge thanks to George. Thanks to the extensive technical team who made themselves visible in the gap between the film and the Q&A starting. Some members I didn't know about. Thank you all for filming. Thank you all very much for coming. Do support the season. Support the Garden Cinema in all ways you know how. Members, credible deal. Many of you perhaps are members, enjoying all those luxuries and discounts. Chance to suggest films of your own that you'd like to see. I mean, films of your own potentially, but films... yeah, maybe let's keep that one to the side for Gold Card members only. Films of your own desire to see on these screens. 3 screens coming soon. 3rd screen upstairs. Many thanks for coming. Enjoy the rest of the season. Thanks to George and the Garden Cinema. Huge thanks to Ed Platt. Thank you very much.